Hello, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, Director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, and welcome to New Wine Tastings. I'm with my new friend, Ian Jaquiss, who is the Interim Coordinator, Interim Director,
Interim ADA Coordinator.
Interim ADA Coordinator at OHSU, Oregon Health and Science Universities. Ian, could you tell us a bit about matters pertaining to the American Disabilities Act, ADA,
Yep.
in the Affirmative Action and Equal Opportunity Department, where you work,
Yep.
at OHSU. Could you tell us a bit about some of what you do there?
So I do a lot of things. Originally, my job was limited to making OHSU a more welcoming place for people with disabilities from an employment perspective. Several years ago, before I started at OHSU, somebody realized that there were not a lot of people with obvious disabilities who worked there. So they did some research on and found out partially why that was. And one of the things they found out was that people without obvious disabilities were reluctant to talk to people with obvious disabilities for fear of saying the wrong thing. So initially, my work, and still a lot of my work, is helping people overcome that fear of talking to people with disabilities. I try to encourage people to relate to other people with disabilities on a people level, on a personal level, so get to know the person, not the disability. So that was a lot of my work, and now I have added responsibilities to help address some of the structural issues, some of the physical barriers that people experience at OHSU, navigating the campus or navigating particular buildings, whatever it is. So it's sort of, in broad strokes, a position around awareness raising. So I try to make OHSU a more welcoming place culturally and also physically.
You know, that's interesting because we're going to be working together on a conference next week, actually, that's titled From Isolation to Invitation, a conference on disabilities for New Wine, New Wineskins. And I just think even in preparations for this conference, I've wondered how often do people, quote unquote, without disabilities feel a great reluctance, I'd hate to say repugnance, for even thinking about the issues of disabilities for whatever reason or reasons. And so it's interesting to me, it wasn't part of my questioning, but it was interesting to me that you even raised that people don't even know how to have a conversation. And I think it's so important, like you said, don't think about the disability, think about the person who has a disability. And I'm sure there are discussions where someone would say, well, you can't separate my disability from me as a person, and that's some of what we'll get into with the conference, but I just think that reluctance, hate to say the word, repugnance, that people might have, it's just like, those are some of the barriers we honestly have to engage and address.
Yeah, absolutely. Until we can talk, the rest doesn't really matter. I mean, until people feel welcoming, engaged, it's going to be hard to overcome a lot of the other struggles people with disabilities face in society.
So please share briefly about what the ADA was established to do.
So it was.
If you want to define it again for.
Yeah. So the Americans with Disability Act was passed into law in 1991 by the first President Bush, and initially it was only for people with physical disabilities, which was a huge miss. Because most people with disabilities, and it's 20% of the population, so 1 out of every 5 people has a disability. So initially,
1 out of 5.
1 out of 5, and that's worldwide.
Wow.
So I say in my training that the big message to people who are reluctant or uncomfortable talking to people with disabilities is they need to get over that, because pretty soon we're going to rule the world.
Yeah.
Where there are a lot of us.
That's good.
Yeah,
That's
so
good.
Just to put a little fear into people, it's healthy sometimes. So originally the Americans with Disability Act was supposed to create opportunity for people with disabilities. People with disabilities have as far as I know, in this culture, been the least educated and the least employed, and have had the hardest time accessing programs. And the ADA was in broad strokes supposed to address that, to give people, to make the proverbial playing field level, so that from getting into buildings, so something that seems as obvious as getting into buildings, to having access to the things inside the buildings once you get in the buildings, having access to programs, access to higher education, access to jobs. So there's still now, almost 30 years since the ADA passed, there's a reluctance for employers to hire people with disabilities because they're afraid of what hiring a person with a disability is sort of for a lot of people, opening the great unknown. What will a person with a disability need to perform the essential functions of the job? And from my perspective, from a work perspective, the ADA was built to address that because it has a concept called the reasonable accommodation clause. So that if a person with a disability is qualified to do the job with or without an accommodation, the employer should provide that accommodation, should hire the person and provide that accommodation if necessary, as long as it's reasonable. So as long as it's not an undue burden on the employer to provide that accommodation. So I think that originally what happened, and still happens today, is that people without disabilities assume that every person with a disability will need an accommodation. And they assume that those accommodations will be expensive. And they assume that by bringing in somebody who's different, it will change the culture and the workflow and change the office or change the workspace. And like a lot of things, all those assumptions are wrong. So backtracking just a little bit, not every person with a disability needs an accommodation. In fact, most don't. Not every accommodation costs money. In fact, most don't. And accommodations on average in this country cost about $400, which in the grand scheme of things is not a lot of money. And studies show that people with disabilities are actually more likely to stay with a job once they get it, and they have fewer days of absence, and are generally more productive. Now,
probably more creative generally, I would assume, in certain ways, and resilient.
There's certainly a theory, there's certainly some support to that we people with disabilities have had to adapt to, acclimate to some extent, and we know how to figure stuff out so that we can participate, because we've had to do that even since the ADA was passed. And
to work through things, it requires a lot of resilience. So yeah. I would assume that comes into play.
Right.
And so for an employer, when they're thinking of cost-benefit analysis, they should account for that as well.
I wish they would.
Yeah.
I wish they would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. You know, why is it? Again, this wasn't part of the original questioning, but when you said that the first President Bush, under his watch, came up with this and was focused on those with visible disabilities.
Right.
Someone was missed. Why would they have only focused on visible? And could you even differentiate? Could you tell us, like, what visible? Maybe it's not just physical, but you know, what do you differentiate there?
So generally, it's in my work, it's hidden disabilities versus obvious disabilities. So an obvious disability is something that you can see, whether you know what the disability is. So I use a wheelchair on a day-to-day basis. By looking at me, you can't tell what my disability is, just that I have a disability. So that would be an obvious disability. And then a hidden disability would be, there are so many of them, but a hidden disability, and for the purpose of the ADA, disability is defined as a physical or mental limitation, substantial limitation, to one or more major life activity. So physical or mental impairment substantially limits one or more major life activity. So a condition that causes a substantial limitation. So cancer would be a hidden disability, or congestive heart failure, or something that affects a major life activity. So a major life activity, we do them all. We don't do them all. I can't do them all. But there are 28 of them, and it's as simple to think of what are you doing now? You're sitting, you're communicating, you're working, you're breathing, your heart's beating. So it's that. It's major life activities. What do you have to do every day? And so
thank you.
Yeah. So it's pretty basic, but it's remarkably complex.
Yeah, and we often take these things for granted.
Yep.
I mean, we often take them for granted.
Yeah, and we all do it.
Yeah. Now, what are some practical steps individuals with disabilities can take to advocate for themselves? Because you're an advocate, you're a professional advocate.
Yeah, I'm a professional advocate.
Yeah. So what can individuals with disabilities do to advocate for themselves in your estimation?
I'm not, and I don't mean to be dismissive of the language in that question, but I'm a huge believer in language, and language can be empowering, and language can be limiting, and I don't like the phrase individual with a disability.
Okay.
And I don't mean to be critical.
No, it's helpful. I mean, I want to grow. I want to
Right.
understand.
So the reason I don't like individual with a disability is Paul, if I were to ask you, do you think of yourself as a person or as an individual? So let me take that one step back. I assume that you drink a caffeinated beverage every morning. I shouldn't make assumption, but if you do, are you a coffee person or a tea person?
Usually coffee.
Okay, so when I asked you that question, you didn't think, individually, I like coffee. You thought personally. Or you might have thought personally, but you think of yourself as a person, you don't think of yourself as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the phrase individual with a disability is very distancing, because you don't think of yourself as an individual, you think of yourself as a person. And by saying individual with a disability, that's an arm length, that's what I call an arm length phrase. I'm keeping that person, that individual an arm length away from me. So I'm a big believer in person first language. See the person with a disability, so that I'm assuming that you don't have a spinal cord injury. I do have a spinal cord injury. You and I will have a hard time bonding over that, but I too am a coffee drinker. I too am a great dresser, like I can tell you are. So there are things that we can bond over that we have in common. We don't have a disability in common, so let's not focus on the disability. Let's focus on the person.
Yeah, very good. I appreciate it. So again, if I were to rephrase that, if I'm understanding correctly, what are some practical steps persons with disabilities
Great.
can take to advocate for themselves?
That's a great question.
You're a personalist, which I want to be. Personally, I'm doing a book on personalism, but I blew it just there a few minutes ago.
You didn't know it.
So it's okay. Nice. I need to stop drinking coffee and drink tea. So
no, I'm married to one of those. Don't do that. So I'm going to make another suggestion.
Good.
Don't be hard on yourself. You didn't know, right? And I know I know we're kidding, but what people, this is the fear. This is where it all comes from. I'm going to say the wrong thing, and if I say the wrong thing, I'm going to offend that person. And if I offend that person, then who knows what's going to happen? And then as a result,
we don't have the conversation to begin with.
Right. So
excellent.
So if you make a mistake, so what? Move on. Learn
well, I'll
from
keep
it,
drinking
right?
coffee then.
There you go. This is okay. It's nice knowing you.
Yeah, that's right.
Great working with you.
No, hopefully you'll answer my question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So to advocate for yourself, know that you have a right. You have a right to participate. You have a right to attend. You have a right to be you are a full-fledged member. A person with a disability is a full-fledged member of society and has the equal right to it that a person without a disability has. Whether that's public transportation or public programming or attending events or working or not working or going to the park or not going. They have every right, and they have to know that, and not just know it, they have to believe it. And they have to know how, not necessarily to stand up for, because that's an ableist phrase, and we can talk more about that later, but to believe in that and to ask the questions, if somebody's treating them in a way that they think is not appropriate and they're treating them based on that disability, based on that perceived limitation, they need to say something. And then if they don't feel empowered to say something at that time, they need to find an ally. There are lots of allies out there, lots of people who want to be allies, and to make that call, and that might be. For example, if you are battling cancer, you could call the American Cancer Society. If you have a spinal cord injury or something like that, you can call Disability Rights Oregon. If you have any disability, you can call Disability Rights Oregon, and they will be an ally for you, and they will be they may be a voice for you.
Yeah, that's good. I'm just writing that down. It's helpful. And so, could you give another example of what that looks like, where someone needs to become more aware of their rights,
right,
and how to express they're concerned for that if they feel that someone is not engaging appropriately, that person.
Well, sadly, on the spot, I can't think of a good example of what that might be. So, one thing that I struggle with, and I try to be better at, is if I get bad service, or if I come to a place that's purposefully not accessible or hasn't been made accessible, I will go somewhere else. I will take my, and I have that ability to do that, and not everybody does. And I understand it's a privilege I have. I will not attend that meeting now, and then perhaps call afterwards, or perhaps try to talk to the organizer, talk to the person, talk to the event after the event, so that maybe it's better next time, right? So one of the things, one of the struggles is that I want everything now, right? Because I'm a citizen, and I'm a person, and I have all these rights. But it's a slow curve. It's a slow learning curve. It's hard to get everything you want when you want it, and sometimes you have to fight the longer fight.
Yeah, so I think you actually gave a good example, and what it caused me to think about is like just even access, like
right.
Access to a building, and access within a building, access to a room and such. If you don't have that access, you'll go elsewhere. You might say after the event, or during the event, or beforehand, hey, could you help? Or you might ask someone who you know is an advocate, an ally with you,
yep.
to do so, just even on matters of access, which I take for granted in a building like this. I rarely use the elevator. You know, how accessible might this building be to someone who has difficulty, to a person who has difficulty climbing stairs, or
right.
can't climb stairs,
right.
or whatever. You know, we have an elevator, but I mean, it's things that we take for granted all the time that you can take for granted, but you also have a right
yep.
to expect that there is access,
right.
And how to go about gaining that. And people need to be aware of that, and to know who their allies are if they need those allies.
Right.
So, and then speaking of the matter of allies, what are some practical ways their social networks can advocate with and for these persons?
So one of the frustrating things is it's hard to experience a new type of barrier. And so what I mean by that is that what you experience may be the first time you've experienced that, but somebody's experienced it before. And you may be able to lean on somebody else's experience or knowledge on how to address, or how to change, or how to go about it a different way. Mm-hmm. So there's the internet is a wonderful yet terrible place. There's lots of great resources available on the internet. There are lots of great organizations, locally, regionally, nationally, who you can lean on for questions relative to the ADA. A favorite of mine is the Northwest ADA Center, which is a federally, it's one of, I think, 11 regional centers. It's got an Oregon office. It's the Northwest ADA Center is based in Seattle at the University of Washington campus, but there's an Oregon office. There's a toll-free number. There's a great website with great information. And if they don't know the answer, they have 10 other regional centers that will. That's a great resource for anybody with a disability who might be struggling, or might think that they're struggling, or might encounter something that they think isn't quite right.
So, I mean, for example, at OHSU, there's you.
There's
right?
me. Right.
And so people who are struggling in a situation at OHSU, hopefully they know that they can go to you to do that.
Hopefully.
To get support and counsel on how to proceed.
Yep.
Then there is, like you mentioned, the Northwest ADA Center, Disability Rights of Oregon.
Yep.
On and on it goes.
On and on. The city of Portland has an ADA coordinator, same title as mine. And the county has somebody who deals with issues relative to disability.
Multnomah County?
Yeah, and pretty much any government of any size, city, county, state, we'll have somebody who you can reach out to.
That's good.
Maybe difficult to find, but it's worth finding.
Yeah, thank you. How does advocacy with and for persons with disabilities cause our society as a whole to flourish, including both in the nonprofit and for-profit domains? And we had talked a little bit about for-profit, I would assume, earlier. A lot of employers won't hire because they think it's going to be too costly. They'd be surprised in many situations. But how does this kind of advocacy actually help cause our society to flourish?
Well, I think that it's a different type of diversity than we traditionally refer to, and the more perspectives, the better. And I think that there rarely is only one way to do something, and a person with a disability may bring a different perspective. We'll have a different perspective, and it may be substantially different, and it may open the eyes of the people with whom they're working or with whom they're collaborating to help them branch out.
Yeah, thank you. What are your hopes for this conference, from isolation to invitation, a conference on disabilities that New Wine is hosting?
Well, I hope that it's eye-opening for people, and that it's a way to build inclusivity. It's a way to build opportunity. It's a way for people to meet other people. The word isolation terrifies me, it depresses me, as I think it probably does a lot of people. But I think of people who I know who haven't had the opportunities that I've had, who haven't had the luck that I've had, who haven't had the chance to see and do the things that I've done, and not necessarily that I've done all these great things, but I just wish that people with disabilities weren't so isolated, and it's there's a physical isolation, and then there's a mental isolation, and then there's I think there's attitudinal enforced isolation, and a lot of it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, just communication. I see people. I am clearly not a person who's blind, but I was speaking to a person who's blind, a colleague at OHSU, about an experience that I have where people will not make eye contact with me in a hallway situation or in passing. And just something else is a lot more interesting to look at than I am when I'm going past somebody. And I asked, and I shared that experience with this person, and the person with whom I was speaking, she is completely blind. She said, "I can tell when I walk by somebody, because almost universally people stop so that they won't get in her." She assumes so that they won't get in her way, whatever that way might be, right? So that she walks by people who are stationary, who weren't stationary, because she can sense movement and she can sense non-movement. And just the thought of that's a different kind of ignoring than any.
And so she takes it as almost ignoring, that not seeing her as fully personal.
Absolutely. I mean,
isolation.
She's a wonderful person with great stories and a tremendous sense of humor, and just really enjoyed speaking to her. And I think of all the people who have opted to not give her that chance, and I think there's a toll on that. There's a toll to that. And again, going back to to your previous question, how could having more exposure to people with disabilities help somebody? Well, just in the 30 minutes she and I spoke, I felt better just knowing that there are people out there with this great spirit and this great intelligence and this great sort of warmth, I'm sad that more people don't get to experience that.
Ian Jaquiss, Paulos Metzger, thank you, Ian, so much for the collaboration with the conference and for taking time for this interview. Thank you for joining us for New Wine Tastings, and there'll be more of this at the conference with Ian and with others, dealing with moving from isolation to invitation and inclusion. this conference on disabilities. Thank you once again.